Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Antony.
And this is Words and Numbers. What's new and exciting in your world this weekend?
One of our Patreon sponsors, Dale, asks what it means for the government debt to be downgraded, as it was several days ago. Credit rating agencies rate individuals' credit worthiness, so you have some credit score, and the higher that score is, the lower interest rates you'll tend to be charged on your credit card or mortgage or whatever. In that same fashion, there are rating agencies that rate the credit worthiness of institutions that issue bonds. The big three agencies are Standard & Poor's, Dun & Bradstreet, and Fitch. Now, rating the credit worthiness of an institution, particularly something like the government, is much more difficult than rating the credit worthiness of a household, because consumers' and households' behaviors are much more predictable, and the sorts of financial arrangements they can come into are much more limited. But here we have a situation where one of the rating agencies, Fitch, downgraded its rating of the credit worthiness of federal debt. Now, the last time this happened, or I should say the first time this happened in modern history, was in 2011, when S&P, Standard & Poor's, revised downward its estimate of the credit worthiness of the federal debt. As a side note, where individuals' credit worthiness goes on some scale of whatever it is, some low number up to the high as like 800 or 850, ratings for the credit worthiness of institutions go by letters. So you'll see, for example, things like the credit worthiness is rated AAA or AA+. Junk bonds, if you recall back in the 1980s when they were a popular investment, junk bonds were rated in the B- or C range. So depending on which of these rating agencies you're dealing with, S&P or Dun & Bradstreet or Fitch, their rating scales vary somewhat, but they all kind of look like these letters, A, B, C. Now, of course, because they're separate rating agencies, they won't necessarily agree on credit worthiness. So we have in 2011, S&P downgrading federal debt, and then just some days ago, Fitch downgrading its estimate of federal debt. So to Dale's question, what does this mean? In the same way that lenders are less apt to lend to individuals with lower credit scores, so too, investors will be less apt to lend to institutions, in this case the federal government, that have lower credit scores. The way to bring the lenders back is to offer them higher interest rates. Someone with a 600, 700 credit score is going to pay a much higher interest rate on his or her credit cards than will someone with an 800 or an 850. Now keep in mind, although the federal government's debt was downgraded, it was downgraded from Fitch's highest rating, which I believe was AAA, down one notch to AA+. So in the great scheme of things, the rating agencies are still rating federal government debt to be highly safe. What was newsworthy is that the downgrade happened at all. In business schools, students are taught that federal debt is the safest debt of all debt on the planet. So to go from status of perfectly safe to somewhat less than perfectly safe is a big deal. The question now is, what's the impact? As with loans to individuals, investors who are looking to loan money to the federal government will tend to demand a higher interest rate in exchange for taking on what is now slightly riskier debt. On the one hand, because the downgrade indicates an increase in perceived riskiness, but that perceived riskiness is relatively small, you would expect that it might not have much of an effect. That, okay, maybe investors will want a little bit more interest when they loan to the federal government, but you can't imagine it's going to be much because we're talking about debt that went from being perfect to just being slightly less than perfect. But on the other hand, again, this is a big deal because any movement away from perfection is, at least relatively speaking, substantial. Where we're left is with the question, how are investors going to react? If investors perceive this isn't a big deal, they won't demand much more interest, and life will go on pretty much the same as it has been. If, on the other hand, investors see this as a big deal, or perhaps even as a portent of things to come, they'll tend to demand much more interest on federal debt. Now, what is much more interest? I don't know, fractions of a percent. But while fractions of a percent may not mean much to you or me, if you're paying 4% on a mortgage versus 4.1%, it doesn't matter that much. But if you're sitting on $32 trillion worth of debt, a 1/10 of a percentage point increase in your interest rate means an extra $32 billion a year in interest expense. The higher the federal government's interest expense is, either the more it's going to have to charge us in taxes to pay for that additional interest, or the more it's going to have to cut back on government spending somewhere else to afford the money for the interest, or of course it can print money and then that comes back. We all have experienced this in the form of inflation. But either way, regardless of what the federal government does here, raising taxes, cutting spending somewhere else, or printing money to pay for the interest expense, if the downgrade in the federal debt leads to higher interest rates on federal debt, then the taxpayers are going to be paying in one or more of those three forms. Now, the astute listener may come back and say, well, yes, except this increase in interest rates only applies to debt the government issues from this point forward. In other words, when the federal government borrows, it borrows in what you or I would think of as fixed rate terms. For example, if the government borrows $100 at 3% interest, that 3% interest remains until that $100 is paid off. If interest rates rise, the 3% doesn't rise. It's fixed, 3%. So someone can come back and say, well, the increase in interest rates, they don't matter that much because, yes, the federal government has $32 billion in debt, but that debt has already been issued. It's outstanding. The increase in interest rates don't apply to that debt. They only apply to additional debt the federal government takes on in the future. And that's correct, except when federal debt comes due, and it doesn't come due all at once, it comes due in bits and pieces. So the federal government issues treasury bonds. Each treasury bond has a certain life, and when it reaches the end of that life, the federal government has to pay back whatever the face value is on the treasury bond. So federal debt is constantly in bits and pieces coming due. And what happens when the debt comes due? Well, the federal government issues new treasury bonds. It's the same thing as you getting a credit card bill and paying the bill by charging another credit card. You roll the debt over. And here's where things get a little bit sticky, because the average life of federal debt is around 4 to 5 years. In other words, over the course of 4 to 5 years, 1/2 of the federal debt will have come due and been rolled over. So if interest rates rise today, interest rates on the whole $32 billion don't rise. The interest rate only rises on new debt the federal government issues starting tomorrow. But the $32 trillion in debt, half of that is going to come due within the next 4 to 5 years, which means over the course of the next 4 to 5 years, as the federal government rolls over that debt, it's going to roll it over at the new higher interest rates. And so, over the course of whatever, let's say approximately 10 years, that $32 trillion in debt gets rolled over at the higher interest rates. The bottom line is, increasing interest rates do impact the existing $32 trillion of debt. It just doesn't impact it immediately. It will take perhaps a decade or more for almost all of the $32 trillion to be impacted. And one other thing's important here that is kind of implied in everything I've said, but I'll say it explicitly. The federal government pays market rates. The interest rate on the federal debt is determined by market forces. When the federal government goes to borrow money, it prints up a bunch of treasury bills and puts them for sale on the market. Investors will offer money for these things, and if the price is right, they'll pay the money, and if the price is too high, they won't, and the federal government will have to ask for lower money, whatever it is. There's a whole auction process that goes on here. But the point is, the interest rate on the debt ends up being a market phenomenon. It's something the federal government doesn't have control over, or I should say it doesn't have direct control over, because we have the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve can, as it has been doing recently, drive interest rates up with contractionary monetary policy, or it can drive interest rates down with expansionary monetary policy. And as interest rates go up or down, in turn, when the federal government goes to borrow more money, it's borrowing at these market interest rates, which may be lower or higher depending on what the Federal Reserve does. And you look at all of that and you say, okay, I know how to fix this problem of increased interest expense on the federal debt. We have the Federal Reserve conduct expansionary monetary policy, increase the money supply, which will drive interest rates down. And then when interest rates go down, the interest expense on the debt goes down, and that's good news for the government's budget. But I remind you of what economists keep telling us. There's no such thing as a free lunch. The way the Federal Reserve drives interest rates down is ultimately by expanding the money supply. But when it expands the money supply, we get inflation. And so we're back to this idea of the taxpayer having to fund the interest expense, either in the form of the government actually incurring higher interest expense because interest rates are high, and thereby having to tax taxpayers more or cut back on spending somewhere else, or taxpayers have to pay in the form of inflation as the Federal Reserve tries to drive interest rates down, so interest expense is less, but now we have inflation, and so taxpayers' dollars are worth less. So Dale, that's a lot of words that boil down to a downgrade in the federal debt is not good news for taxpayers. How much of bad news it is, we don't know yet. My guess is not much. But if this is the first of what's going to be a sequence of downgrades as the federal government becomes less and less able to manage its debt, then ultimately it ends up being the first in a series of what will be ever-increasing bad news. For one-stop shopping for all things James and Ant, visit our website, wordsandnumbers.org. We give a special shout-out to our Patreon sponsors who help us keep the lights on. If you'd like to contribute, go to patreon.com/wordsandnumbers. We received, after our episode on, what's the name of that film?
It's a wonder to me that you thought it was a good movie, but you can't remember the name of it. And I thought it was terrible, and I'll tell you, it was The Sound of Freedom.
The Sound of Freedom. After our episode on The Sound of Freedom, where we discussed the term trafficking, we got a bunch of email and comments from listeners saying that no, we had it wrong. Trafficking does not require moving something from one place to another, as we had said, but rather it's simply the trade in illegal goods or services.
All right, let's stop right there. The common sense definition of traffic is to move from one place to another. That's what it is.
Yeah, but we're talking about legal issues, and legal issues don't turn on common sense definitions. They turn on the actual definition.
No, we're not talking about legal issues. We're talking about language.
What I was talking about at the time was how the Justice Department defines human trafficking. And that's a legal issue.
And what I was talking about at the time is what traffic actually means.
I hear you, but I looked up the Oxford English Dictionary, which, by the way, people who discuss things back and forth online invariably, as one of our listeners did, simply Googled what does trafficking mean and gave me whatever Google spit out. Typically, Google will spit out the Merriam-Webster definition. The Oxford English Dictionary, at least among academics, is considered the gold standard for definitions in the English language. So if you've got a discussion that hinges on the definition of some term, that's where you need to go, the OED.
The nice part about the OED is that it'll give you the etymology of a word, right? It'll show you where it comes from and how it's developed over time.
And as I looked up trafficking the noun, I was astounded. It seems the listeners are correct. I have an earlier definition and a later definition. The earlier definition is the action of engaging in typically clandestine dealings or communications with another. The later definition is the process of arranging or negotiating something, probably in the context of private communication or secretive dealings. What's astounding to me is in neither of those definitions was there any sense of having to move something from one point to another.
And I went instead and looked up the word to traffic, the verb, and you absolutely have to move something from one place to another.
Okay, so notice what we're doing here. I'm talking about the noun and you're talking about the verb. But in the context of our discussion, we're talking about human trafficking. It's the noun that's being used.
No, it's not.
It
means
is. Human
that something
trafficking.
Must be, no, it's not. That's just an expression. It means that something must be trafficked, which is a verb. It's the verb that matters.
OED also has a definition for specifically human trafficking. And their definition is the action or practice of subjecting people to forcible relocation or coercion in order to benefit from their work or service, typically in the form of forced labor, sexual exploitation.
Well, then I've been trafficked repeatedly.
Now notice this very interesting thing. I'm going to read this definition again because I just saw something I didn't see before. The action or practice of subjecting people to forcible relocation or coercion in order to benefit from their work. Now, how do I read that? Do I mean subjecting people to forcible relocation or coercion? Or do I mean subjecting people to forcible relocation, comma, or subjecting them to coercion?
Well, the question obviously is there a comma in the text?
There is not a comma in the text.
Then there's your answer.
But this is just fascinating, though, because this whole discussion, which is the definition of human trafficking so broad as to include illegal acts that have nothing to do with moving people from one location to another?
Or is it so broad that when my mother said to me, "You will get a job, whether you want to or not," was I trafficked? I was coerced.
Right, you were coerced. This sounds to most people, I'm sure, like we're nitpicking. Is there a comma or is there not?
We are absolutely not nitpicking.
No, and I think that's the important thing. People have got to take definitions seriously because when we communicate, we're attempting to move an idea from one human brain to another. It's the words that do the work. If the words are inadequate, if they aren't fully reflecting what you mean, then you have problems, like the problem that I had when I was doing the research for that episode. I'm seeing numbers for human trafficking. At first, I wasn't understanding whether the numbers strictly represented forcibly moving people from one place to another or whether they included forced sex work where people weren't being moved from one place to another. And it seems indeed it's that latter.
Or, worse yet, did they include voluntary sex work?
Right. And again, it sounds like nitpicking until you realize that if your goal was to come up with a number, how prevalent is this? Well, all of a sudden, the definition matters because altering the definition in these little nitpicky ways that we're talking about can throw the numbers off by an order of magnitude. They could be 10 times more or 1/10 the size.
That's right. And something like this becomes an issue when we discuss the kidnapping of children in the United States.
Right.
How many children are kidnapped in the United States? Well, the number is actually jaw-dropping when you see it.
I just looked it up today, as a matter of fact.
How about that? How does that always seem to happen? We actually never talk about these things prior to recording the episode. And yet I'll tell you, and then you can correct me if I'm wrong in any way, that when you separate out immediate family members from the kidnappers, the numbers drop to almost nothing.
I don't know what the number is there. I have seen references to the number of kidnappings that are due to someone in the immediate family. And typically that's in the case of parents being separated, one of the parents grabbing the kids and running off with them. That constitutes a large fraction of total child kidnappings. But total child kidnappings in the U.S. were 8,500 in the latest year. I think it was 2022. 8,500, which sounds like a lot until you put it in context of the number of children in the U.S. By children, I mean people under age 18. That 8,500 is 1% of 1%.
Right. We don't have a kidnapping problem in the United States. And how do you know? Because when it actually happens, the whole world stops. When we hear of a kidnapping on the news, it's all we can talk about or think about. And that's how you know it's an outlier. You and I say this a lot about a lot of the things that people are frightened of. The reason why they're frightened of these things is because they happen so rarely, and when they do, they're seemingly random. It's like a lightning strike. Of course you're going to be afraid of being struck by lightning because it's completely random.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, you've got a better chance at winning the lottery. How do I know this? More people win the lottery every year than get struck by lightning.
Exactly.
It's real easy to do the math on this one. And here we are with this trafficking business, right? So people get all worked up because they see a movie or they watch a news story that plays real fast and loose with the facts. And all of a sudden they think a terrifying thing is very prevalent and it alters their behavior. Before you know it, you get a guy invading a pizzeria because he's convinced that there's child trafficking happening in the back room. Or people start thinking that Wayfair is selling children. I remember when this nonsense happened, a lot of people were saying things like, well, if there's any chance at all, I'm not buying anything from Wayfair. Well, there was never any chance at all.
You introduced the topic of assault weapons, and this is one that has constantly annoyed me. Politicians are using this term. In fact, it's almost as if in the debate on guns, that the two sides refuse to come to some common terminology, precisely so they can just keep arguing. And every time I hear a debate back and forth, it seems to be the two people are just talking past each other. The terms they're using aren't well defined. An assault weapon is the beautiful one. There is no definition of assault weapon.
Let's go further. There's no such thing as an assault weapon.
People will raise their eyebrows and say, well, clearly there is. It's a weapon that's used in an assault.
Every weapon that is used in an assault. Now you've got a list of every weapon.
Exactly. And that's the problem. People who are interested in gun rights don't like this term assault weapon because when politicians use it, they end up using it to apply to all weapons.
Let's stop and apply our own logic to ourselves. It's an assault rifle, not an assault weapon.
Now, that is a term.
It is, but not in the way it's commonly used.
It hits exactly this topic. OED has a definition for assault rifle. It is a rifle designed for military use that is capable of both automatic and semi-automatic fire. Those terms have specific meanings, automatic and semi-automatic fire. An assault rifle is capable of both those things.
Right, but read the first part again.
A rifle designed for military use that is capable...
All right, stop right there. Designed for military use. And what do you see all the time in public arguments? You see that civilians shouldn't have, quote, weapons of war. They don't. Without a very specialized permit that almost no one gets, it is illegal to have an automatic weapon. You can't go buy an automatic weapon, what people commonly refer to as a machine gun, off the rack somewhere. That just doesn't happen. The weapons that you can buy are not designed for military use. They're designed for civilian use.
Now, some of them are designed to look like they're for military use.
What something looks like and what something can do are two completely different things.
What matters is what its functionality is. No matter what it looks like, it does not function as a military rifle.
That's right. And when the politicians got around to defining assault rifle, what they ended up doing was they took a bunch of characteristics, right? So a heat shield, a pistol grip, things like this. And they said, if the gun has more than X number of these things, then it's an assault rifle. If it has to be 3 or more, and I pick these 2 and you pick those 2, what's the magic in the number 3? The magic is in the characteristics and capabilities of the weapon. So what ends up happening is a bunch of politicians pick things that look really scary and say, okay, this is what makes it an assault rifle, but I can go out and buy you right now. Well, I can't buy you, so let's not go crazy. I can go out and purchase a Ruger Mini 14, which is what anybody would call a ranch rifle or a plinker, something you typically use to shoot squirrels on a ranch. Mm-hmm. That shoots the same round at the same velocity as the assault rifles that the politicians want you to be terrified of. It's the same gun.
But notice what happens here. When you have a politician using the term, or anybody using the term assault weapon, which has no definition, The politician has now the ability to make all sorts of promises and claims to which he can't be held and which can't be verified precisely because the thing has no meaning.
You know, not to put yet another shameless plug, but you and I wrote a book a while back called Cooperation and Coercion, and everybody should go buy it. In this book, we wrote a chapter on guns, and we took a look at the assault weapons ban. You might remember the assault rifle ban. Assault rifles were, in fact, banned. They were defined in this creaky, ridiculous way that made no sense, and they were banned. And gun-related violence started going down.
Right, it did.
Well, gun-related violence continued going down. It had already started going down, but it did continue going down precipitously. And then 10 years later, the ban was sunsetted because the original legislation only lasted for 10 years. And you would think that with all these scary assault rifles, again, legal, that people could go out and buy, that gun violence would start skyrocketing, but it just kept going down.
At the same pace that it had been going down during the ban and prior to the ban. Yeah.
That's right. So here's the news flash. The ban had nothing to do with any of it.
Yeah. But this episode's not about guns. It's not about trafficking. It's about using language to communicate ideas. I teach a course, Intermediate Microeconomics, and in this course, I teach the students how to communicate mathematically. And I show them, look, the beauty of mathematics is that you can say things in a very precise way that you simply can't say in English. So I start off this semester with this example. I say, tell me, what does this mean, this sentence? Nothing is better than cake. And the students look at me like I've asked them a stupid question. I said, no, think about it. And there are actually two equally valid interpretations that are contradictory. Nothing is better than cake. One is that cake is so good, there's nothing else that's better than it. The other is that cake is so bad that I'd rather have absolutely nothing at all, because nothing is better than cake.
How about that?
But you see the problem. If you want to be precise about something, whether it's talking about regulating guns or dealing with human trafficking, you need information. To get the information, you've got to define what it is you're talking about. And the English language, or any language for that matter, is not suited in a lot of cases to doing this well. Or maybe the problem isn't the language, but it's how we use it.
I don't think the problem is the language. I think the problem is the people. Because who are the villains in our story? And the villains are people who would control you by churning up your emotions about something that frightens you. And you've got this old expression, right? It's a truism. I thought I could go back and find who originally said this. And actually, I couldn't, not quickly anyway. But control the language and you control the masses.
You and I have pointed out several times in the past that there are many organizations that ostensibly exist to fight some injustice or some wrong or whatever it is, that actually benefit from the persistence of the injustice or the wrong. One of the ways that organizations like that can help themselves to continue to exist is to foment strife without appearing to foment strife. In fact, foment strife between people while appearing to actually be fighting for whatever cause it is the organization is set up for. And here you have this thing with assault weapons. People who are afraid of guns and want them to be regulated. There are organizations out there that will lobby for this sort of thing. Those organizations have a vested interest in doing two things. One is convincing you that they're fighting for you so that you'll give them your money. And two, to make sure they don't fight so hard that they actually solve the problem. Because in solving the problem, their reason for existence would disappear. They have an incentive to use terms that have no meaning.
I think it gets a little worse than that, too. Because when I see Joe Biden, and he started again in the wake of the July 4th shootings this year, what did he say? He started beating that tired old drum, common sense solutions. If those were available, wouldn't we have availed ourselves of them decades ago?
Yes.
People who keep saying we need common sense solutions about anything are really saying anybody who disagrees with me has no common sense. And that's just political claptrap. There are people on both sides of the gun debate that are operating in good faith, trying to do their best with the arguments. Now, I happen to disagree with one of those two sides, But I don't think that regular people are operating in bad faith.
We talk about the term trafficking, the term assault weapon. I think a similar thing has happened with the term gender. And again, when I see people debating this, they seem to be talking past each other because they're deliberately avoiding the fact that they're using different definitions of the word. And so someone says, well, how many genders are there? Okay, well, define what you mean by gender, and then we can say something here. But nobody wants to do that.
We've lost our minds on this issue. I mean, collectively, we have lost our minds. We're going to look back on this period of our history, and we're going to wonder what the hell the problem was. And I realize that people on both sides of this debate are nodding their heads in agreement with me.
They are. Both sides are, yes. For very different reasons.
For very different reasons.
And the fact is there something real there that we should be concerned about and address? I would say yes, but we're not going to take one step toward addressing this well as long as we continue to use terms without clearly defining what they mean. And I'm not wedded to any particular definition. Pick whatever one you want. Just make sure that everybody's using it.
And that's not going to happen.
No, it's not going to happen because both sides have a vested interest. I should say it differently. There are factions on both sides that have a vested interest in maintaining the argument, making sure it doesn't get resolved.
I even want to take issue with this idea that there are two sides. We often say this. It's a political shorthand. Both sides this, both sides that. But I think on most issues, there aren't two sides. There are two loudmouth political parties cramming everybody into their preferred narratives.
Yeah, that's fair.
Life is just more complicated than that. I got a lot of hate mail over The Sound of Freedom. There was one that stood out that wasn't hate mail. Apparently, I said something about the truth actually having to matter sooner or later. And that's always where I'm going to come down.
Mm-hmm.
The truth actually matters, and I don't really care what your preferred narrative is. I care what the truth is. And to the extent that your preferred narrative is true, hey, I'm with you.
Yeah.
But we should be arguing in good faith and at low volume about what the truth is, because there you can do what the philosophers should be doing. They should be making assertions and then engaging in the giving of reasons. And if your reasons are better than my reasons, I have to change my assertion.
But the first step to doing that is agreeing on the definitions of the words we're going to be using as we form and posit our reasons. Otherwise, we're just wasting everybody's time.
I think that is so clearly obvious that reasonable people shouldn't have to state it. And yet, here we are.
Right.
If what I just said is correct, I'm dealing with a lot of unreasonable people. I'm happy enough to just think that that's what's happening at this point. I think everybody picks their echo chamber and they stay in it. They're comfortable there, and that's just how it is.
One last important thing to emphasize, I think, is that even if we are in agreement on the definitions of the terms that we're using as we discuss various topics, that doesn't mean that we're going to come to agreement on the topics themselves. We can disagree because you weight certain things more or less than I do, or because our preferences are different, or because we process the complex arguments differently. Agreeing on terminology doesn't necessarily mean we're going to agree on topics. However, agreeing on the terminology does enable us, when we do end up disagreeing on the topic, to walk away from each other understanding why we disagree. And I think that's one of the big problems that we have in today's modern discourse. We often aren't using the same definitions when we engage in discussion with others. And so when we necessarily don't agree because we're talking about different things, we walk away assuming that the other person is either stupid or malicious or both. So in the end, using words well, having a common understanding of what they mean as we use them, enables us at the least to conduct discourse civilly.
And that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Until next time, be sure to follow us on Twitter. Handles are in the show notes. Join Words and Numbers Backstage, the Facebook group where the conversation continues, and
send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
Until next week, try to be nice to one person. One person who doesn't deserve it. Just one. And who knows, it may turn into a trend. Give it a shot. You might feel good about yourself.
You could say you tried.
You tried, that's right. Till next week, can't take it easy.
See you next week, James.